So if I can invite the speakers from this last session on stage. In a lot of the work that was presented by the three of you, there's a level of seriousness that comes with it. There's a level of pretty in-depth research that comes with it, but yet you have this ability of making it beautiful and following through with it, to whether it's making it a product or open sourcing it or anything to such nature. Can you elaborate a little bit on what kind of effort does it take to take something so in depth and such a kind of like a serious topic and still find the beauty within it?
Well, I guess I would not say that our work pertains to beauty very directly. I guess maybe for us as mathematicians, there's sort of a bit of a cliche that the mathematician finds beauty in mathematical formula, and it's in a sense true that sometimes the most exciting projects that come to us are the ones that involve true technical uncertainty from a mathematical perspective. And these are obviously the most risky projects to take on as well. So I guess our approach to this is to try to strike a balance between taking on projects that we know we can tackle very clearly versus taking on projects that are going to push us to expand our repertoire and trying. There's sort of like a delicate balance there of sort of pricing out. How do you actually put a price on doing new mathematical research, for example? So that's sort of one of the challenges that we encounter.
For us, beauty is part of the propaganda, right? I mean, we want people to believe in this new approach, and so you want to seduce them to it. But in a way, also, beauty is found in these new materials, and you're guided by the properties of the materials and their growth. But also, there is this formal approach that we take that even if you almost want to invent a new form using these new materials.
In a similar vein, I'd say we approach beauty, and if it's a commercial project that we're doing for a client, oftentimes to have it be beautiful is a programmatic requirement, and a lot of times the challenge is actually sometimes convincing our clients that it doesn't have to be beautiful in that one specific way that they have in mind. That it should kind of grow from the requirements of the project at hand and the way that we're achieving it. So it should be kind of an organic thing, but in general, it's just. Yeah, I mean, there's beauty in logic, and there's beauty in the way that certain things come together, just the way that they're meant to. So a lot of times it's purely subjective, but other times it really does grow out of the requirements of the project at hand.
Yeah, with the level of in-depth of research that you're doing, there's a level of robustness that comes with it, right? There's proof behind it. So it's almost kind of, becomes, difficult to say that it won't work or that it's not feasible. So it's kind of almost, you've all decided to take a proactive approach, to this concept of robustness and resiliency versus this kind of, more defensive approach, like instead of, letting, fighting the environment, you're like accepting it and working with it in a way. Is there something you can kind of elaborate on, like what inspires you to be more proactive versus kind of defensive about kind of some of your projects? Or like the kind of underlining concepts behind some of the projects?
Can start? For Terraform 1, this is part of our mission, right? We set to envision the environmental future of cities, and it's a big part of our research, but it's also kind of really going through the process of how this can be inherently buildable, where we started with just pure experimentation, and now we are building it into the built environment. And it's a long process, and you have to do the research, and you have to be able to prove that these materials can be used in a certain way. And now it's kind of to the point where they can meet the code and certain requirements. So we knew kind of we took the approach from science where you have a hypothesis, but it takes a long time, and now it's on the profession to adopt it.
For us, a lot of times it's also about listening and learning to the partners that we have along the way in some of our projects. The Totem project, in particular, was one where we first started thinking about mesh networking and decentralized power grids and basically and something like that we can start to apply on to different projects. So it's very much an iterative process for us, and it's one that it's a constant process of learning and trying to find appropriate opportunities to apply these different, as you say, proactive approaches. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. In the end, it has to function for the task at hand. But we find that there's usually a way to inject at least a fair amount of this kind of proactive agenda towards environmental issues at hand to our projects.
Going on the topic of the mesh network and the series of relationships, Elissa, you're showing some of these kind of like relationship diagrams and the probabilities of the successes and failures, and it was interesting to see that if they were all about 90%, that you would think that the outcome would be 90% probability of success, right? So kind of like taking some of that kind of relationship and probability scenarios, were there findings that were surprising to you that you wouldn't have thought the probability would have been so high or so low in certain situations?
Yeah, I mean, actually, that project was almost entirely surprising. I was surprised, for instance, that the final result was only 70% after the kind of 90% inputs. So I think that's kind of the real outcome there, is that encoding information in that way can reveal insights that are not immediately obvious on an intuitive level. If you just kind of go about things the way you would without sort of thinking about it more structurally, you can end up kind of assuming things, making assumptions that aren't valid. And I mean, this is a kind of a huge part of mathematics, actually, as a discipline, is always kind of returning to first principles, returning to our assumptions. Let's make sure that we are on solid footing, that our assumptions are clear before we start trying to problem solve. And so that's really kind of the heart of what we do at MESH, actually, is this kind of problem solving methodology.
You talked about the concept of first principles, and it kind of echoes a little bit in a little bit of all the talks there. We design things, we design buildings, products, and so on, but there's sometimes, I see it sometimes in my students, well, they'll analyze something, but really they don't need to analyze it if they knew the first principles, of a certain situation, whether it's nature, whether it's the ecosystem, whether it's just human behavior. How much of that do you find is missing in what we do today? Like, have we gone on the computing route because we can, and we've just kind of tossed first principles away? Or do you think that the first principles are still there and we actually are doing something with them?
That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's a mix of both. Sometimes it's true that we're so quick to reach for computation when maybe we need not, and that sometimes it's good to really kind of examine whether or not computation is the appropriate tool. And this is actually especially true with machine learning. And machine learning is this very exciting thing, and we all want to use it, myself included. but it just may not be appropriate for every problem, right? So in that case, sometimes just plain old statistics might do the trick, and I would consider that kind of a first principles approach. But yes, I think it's somehow striking a balance between, education about the amazing tool sets that we have available and also not losing track of the foundations.
I think there's just an example of that is something that we're seeing a lot of right now is generative design. And using generative design tools to kind of inform structural forms. And what I find interesting is I see a lot of people using this absolutely powerful tool, but then in the end not really analyzing the results or actually kind of quantifying the, so say we have a generatively designed chair, speaking of chairs. And it has a structural efficiency of X%. That happens to be 0.05 more efficient than one that's designed somewhat intuitively and has. So as of now, generatively designed structures have a novelty value to them. There's something, they look kind of odd. They look kind of almost deliberately unintuitive, and that's kind of cool. But there's, I always find it interesting when people don't actually, is that 0.05% benefit to efficiency, is that worth kind of throwing our intuitive aesthetic sensibilities out the window once the novelty has passed? So I think to your point, I think there has to be kind of a balance between the two and a certain awareness of when to use these computational tools and how much benefit they actually bring to our process.
Mm. Yeah. Well, I think these new tools are exciting, and hopefully the bio tools that will be available in the future also will be even more exciting. But the thing is, they are tools to achieve what we said to do, and they were the same as the early day of AutoCAD and the pencil before that, right? I mean, buildings are still about light and air and well-being of people, and we cannot forget that.
Are there any questions on the audience side? No? All right, I could ask a couple more on my end. There's always this concept of, there's the variable and then there's the constant, right? Like what do you change, right? And it's the idea, obviously you want a successful outcome of some sort, and success is somewhat vague too in its way, depending on which angle you're looking at. So how do you start to define, what are your constants and what are your variables when you're trying to solve something that is, potentially, a little organic, right? It's something that we're still learning about, right? Even though nature's been around just as long as humanity, one can say, but we're still just kind of at the tip of the iceberg about learning about it. Where do we try to control things, and where do we, try to keep things constant?
I mean, if we take the outcome-based approach, then you design for that, right? I mean, when you have growing materials, you have to understand what it means and kind of the changes, and then build that into your outcomes. When you're dealing with living materials, you have to figure out how death plays part of that too, because ultimately it has to be part of the cycle. So it requires a new approach and also new collaborators. I mean, we are working with biologists and trying to even to understand it down on a DNA level, what are the changes. So new types of skills and new team members also play a role.
Yeah, for us, I usually find, because we work with architects, not as architects, we usually find that there are these hard constraints, but they may be very implicit in the project. And so that's actually one of the places we often start in a kind of problem-solving effort, is to try to really tease out what are the hard constraints of the project. Like this facade cannot go any further than this line, for instance. But sometimes these things are so kind of assumed or implicit in the project that they need to be brought out and kind of set out as these are the hard constraints. And at that point, you can start looking at, okay, what can we vary, what can we play with within that context.
How do you, so you're all taking kind of this, pretty deep level of research, and applying it to your projects, but you're also all collaborating with other individuals, right? The level of depth that you go to is having been on the architecture side for about a decade or so, it's nowhere near as depth as what you folks are doing. So when you start to approach this and you start to work with other individuals, whether be architects or biologists or engineers or fabricators or whatever, what are some of the kind of like strategies that you invoke in order to collaborate so that you don't instill fear in the fact that there's a change in how that things can actually be done, right? There's a level of robustness that you're bringing, and that they, shouldn't fear this robustness that you're instilling in your process.
I mean, it kind of relates to what you were talking about constraints and how you set these constraints. So for us, I think, given the very broad range of projects that we work on, we very much try and work in systems. So instead of designing, a unit of end product, you're really trying to design a system that you can plug in all of these different constraints, and a lot of these constraints are really moved, defined, or obliterated by some of these collaborators that you work with. So for example, when we were working on Totem again, working with Owens Corning on a material that had properties that we had absolutely, those were constraints that were kind of solid. We knew that we could not get radio signal through this part of the project, and then all of a sudden we could. So because we were working, we had kind of a system in place to accept that. That allows us to kind of quickly respond and kind of takes away that element of oh my God, we've invested 560 man hours in this. How are we going to adjust? So part of it is designing to use your word, a robust system that's flexible enough to accept those rather than just a one-to-one approach. Yeah.
I think for us, it's inventing a new way of collaboration where we bring everyone at the table from day one. So a biologist can inform the formal design of a building, and then we've had a sociologist also come and work with us to think about what it does mean to have living materials as part of the environment. But it's not just bringing experts, but you're bringing everyone as part of the design team, and they are allowed to really influence the design. And so it's kind of that fine balance. Okay, so you're there for your expertise, but then at the same time, you're part of the whole team from the beginning.
Yeah, I really like that. And we sort of try to do something very similar, try to get everyone at the table. And I think one of the objectives there is to get some clarity around language. What we find is that people in different disciplines use the same word to mean completely different things. So I think I finally got a handle on what architects mean when they say topology. Still working on the word tectonic, so I'll take some tips later. But yeah, it can just be really difficult to get over this barrier of language when you're working collaboratively across disciplines. So that's something we really try to hash out early on.
Yeah, I've experienced that firsthand, having gone from architecture side to the tech world for a little bit. The concept of model and program, amongst many other vocabularies, are totally and drastically different. But yeah, with that said, are there any other questions? There's 1, 2 right here. We'll start from down here.
Hi, I really enjoyed the presentations a lot, and I think some of these questions are almost like really philosophical in my mind. You can look at evolution, right? And so this is like improving design. There's constraints. A plant could be in the desert. A plant could be in the Arctic. Animals evolve in certain ways, and these are all designs. And there's a subject to constraints, and there's some objective function, which is like the ability to successfully reproduce, right? And we get here, right? And so kind of what you're doing is, maybe the objective design is not to successfully reproduce, but it's to satisfy your client, to satisfy your own sensibilities, and it's designing subject to constraints, right? You have a constraint of radio frequency waves being able to pass through something, or a constraint of, I'm going to use biological materials in this design, right? So there's like almost a mathematical formalism there, right? Which is, I'm trying to solve some equations subject to some constraints and satisfy an objective function, which could be beauty, right? How do you define beauty? Well, that's in the eye of the beholder. So I'm just wondering if that mathematical formalism of, equations, constraints, optimizing something, you don't really think that, maybe, but it's kind of what you do, right? So, you have any comment on my comment?
I mean, it's inherent in the design process, right? I mean, you start with establishing constraints, and then you go through your process and you iterate, and you again, kind of the diverge and converge, right? And that again, all these new technologies and new tools are just means, but the process, it's still the same. So we.
And I think you bring up something like, if in the reduction of maybe reduction, simplification, not to diminish the process, but to make it something that's where we can just quantify it as an equation. I think a lot of designers kind of bristle at that idea because it takes away some of the romanticism of kind of, the creator, the author, the auteur of something. And I think what everybody here is doing, I think, successfully is like being very analytical about these things, and maybe, I'll speak for myself, maybe recognizing that we're nowhere close to reaching this point where a mathematical equation is going to cover all of the bases and automate everything. So there's really no need to be scared of this kind of quantification process. And in fact, it can only drive us further to kind of more complex forms of aesthetic, something that really brings us joy and novelty and all of these great things that we aspire to. So I think it's a great comment.
Yeah, I like the comment too. I think, every now and again I come across a kind of computer science research paper that attempts to somehow generate art or maybe architecture even. And the way they do this is by literally doing this process that you just suggested. So coming up with an objective function that defines beauty. And inevitably the results are pretty limited because it is very, very difficult to actually to quantize this. I think the designers who are bristling at this are correct.
But don't you think that it can help us? It can help drive our dialogue forward. And like some of, for example, some of the artwork that I was recently at an exhibit where they had taught a machine learning algorithm to basically analyze. It had taught itself English through reading Victorian romance novels, and then it was then looking at a painting and then describing the painting using the vocabulary that it had taught itself. And the results were kind of in some ways absolutely ludicrous, but they were also strangely, like once we filter it through our own minds and perceptions, it definitely spurs something that is entirely unique, and I can see that bringing forth new forms of artistic expression that would not have otherwise maybe crossed our minds. So I think there's a really interesting chance to, I don't know if we should bristle or not, but I think we should embrace.
Right, fair enough.
We had one up top.
Hi, thank you for the presentations. I'd like to ask a question to Elissa and Ahmed because they appear to agree a lot, but I think there are also there might be some interesting conflicting ideas. And I'd like to use two keywords, ambiguity and quality, and would like to hear from both of you, because what I see in Elissa's work is it's about a little bit about restricting ambiguity to enable like prediction, right? And which probably can assume that, okay, we can produce more quality or value by restricting ambiguity. Whereas on Ahmed's side, like most of the other designers, it's leveraging ambiguity, right? So like trying to preserve it or the portions of it as much as you can, so you can, again, like produce some sort of like value, meaning, or quality. So how would you kind of like, where is that line? How do you deal with ambiguity while you're trying to either kill or control or let it loose?
So sorry, the two words you
it's ambiguity and quality.
ambiguity and quality.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is super interesting question. So I don't like ambiguity.
I know. That's why I'm.
I mean, that's
Yes,
not
exactly.
our.
That's why I'm
Yeah,
asking.
that's not our job. So our job is to eliminate ambiguity, and that's why people call us.
The interesting thing is, I mean, so I don't want to kind of like extend it too much, but because I see your example is perfect too, like the visual ambiguity, computer like you trying to see the dot on the left or right side of the line, is like when you try to compute it, it's you unsee it, right? So it's interesting. I had exactly the same slide last year about this subject, so that's why I'm also super interested. But the interesting thing for designers, you need that to design.
Right.
That's why I'm asking.
Yeah. Okay. So that's exactly so. And I think one of the themes that I was trying to communicate in my talk is the kind of discrepancy between, say, the geometry of the imagination and the geometry of what we can actually compute. And this is really the fundamental thing that drives my business is when people come up against the limits of what they can compute geometrically. And so often, you know, people will come and say like, but I have two meshes and I want to Boolean them together and I can imagine it in my mind. So can I. But actually to do this, I mean, people write research papers about mesh Booleans. It's not easy. So I guess we don't like ambiguity and we try to resolve it, but maybe a more accurate thing to say is that our business is about coping with ambiguity and doing this in the highest quality way that we can.
Yeah, I think it's a really, really interesting question because as you correctly observed, I think ambiguity can actually be quite beautiful, and I think it's something that we, not just for practical reasons, sometimes you want to, you know, prolong this period of ambiguity until we can actually figure out what we're trying to do exactly. But just on a kind of a fundamental level, I think there's something kind of notionally very beautiful about the ambiguous, about not exposing everything all at once. You know, kind of, you know, what lies in shadows could actually be something that's really beautiful, and is being absolutely 100% precise about it kind of takes away some of that romance. However, you know, we have to build things and they have to work. They have to function the way that we more or less expect them to function. In which case, the notion of ambiguity for us tends to become resolved more in sense of kind of a level of redundancy. So where you know, whatever remaining ambiguity, and because we don't deal in absolutes and because we tend not to be as precise in our solutions, mainly because we really don't always have the tools to be so, we have to build in a certain level of redundancy and a certain level of tolerance, which is maybe a different type of ambiguity. So we're dealing with kind of the conceptual, notional ambiguity, and that's something that we're trying to preserve. And then we have the kind of the more practical, functional ambiguity, and that gets resolved through tolerances and redundancies. And those are things that we absolutely have to build into our designs because we know that in the real world, nothing is built perfectly. So those are kind of the two ambiguities that we deal with.
I mean, one can also argue that there's like a level of ambiguity in some of the research work that Maria was talking about, is that you're looking at the system, and then the system is this natural system that's there, and then the ambiguity part is that letting the system control itself, right, in a way, and it's a system that we may not fully be, be able to grapple with, right, because again, we're still kind of, it's part of this kind of research effort that we're ongoing.
I mean, we embrace ambiguity and then we try to be able to understand it and then manage it in the built environment, but also you cannot really measure quality in a traditional sense anymore because in a performance-based design, you will be looking post-occupancy, you will be looking at the quality of life and well-being in a building. So it can, if in a way, it changes the measure.
Cool, thank you. So with that being said, I'd love to give these folks a round of applause. Thank you.